to the sixth podcast in the series. I'm here with Chris, Don, and Kev. We're recording this one early in the morning, so Kev's not that happy.
Very true, Joe. Very true.
And yeah, this week it's the best films of the 1970s. So Kev's got the summary of the decade this week, so go ahead, Kev.
By the end of the 60s, Hollywood was ready to collapse after a slew of bloated epics that were box office flops. Enter what is now termed New Hollywood, a group of young male directors like Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, George Lucas, William Friedkin, and Francis Ford Coppola, who combine the conventions of classical Hollywood with those of the European art cinema, particularly the French New Wave. For a brief window of time, this band of young directors usurped the conventional wisdom of Hollywood's old guard, creating big-budget films that were filled with narrative and formal experimentation. But low-budget cinema was also thriving in the US, with directors like Barbara Loden, George Romero, Claudia Weil, and John Waters creating some of their best work in the decade. Sitting alongside films with pretensions to the art house were disaster movies like The Towering Inferno and The Poseidon Adventure, which were box office boons for ailing studios. The renaissance in US filmmaking was in part precipitated by a relaxation of censorship laws in both America and the wider world, leading to a wellspring of films which attempted to push the envelope in terms of on-screen nudity and violence. Films like The Devils, Straw Dogs, Salò, and Last Tango in Paris caused headaches for film censors across the globe. Even the British Board of Film Censors almost closed its doors after pressure was placed on it when it allowed The Devils to be shown in cinemas. In Italy, relaxation of censorship laws led to giallo cinema, a particularly gory and regularly misogynistic strain of horror, which would inspire the popular slasher genres of the 80s and also give us the horror masterpiece Suspiria. Many directors fated across Europe during the 50s and 60s were now entering the autumn years of their career and subsequently making some of their best films. Bergman, Truffaut, and Fellini in particular had an excellent decade. In Japan, a new golden age of cinema was emerging, with films like Throw Away Your Books, Rally in the Streets, showing a politically motivated art house that had hitherto not existed in the country. And in Australia, Ozploitation took root after the country adopted an R rating for films in 1971, allowing for a slew of low-budget horrors, comedies, and art house experimentations that would progress in their sophistication throughout the decade. While this raft of exciting cinema was being created across the globe, Hollywood's newfound commitment to auteurism had gone insane. Coppola was spending millions shooting Apocalypse Now in the Philippines and behaving like a deranged captain at the helm of a sinking ship. Friedkin was shitting money up the wall, making the brilliant but bloated epic Sorcerer, and Michael Cimino was racking up $44 million to make the Western Heaven's Gate, which would recoup only $3.5 million at the box office. New Hollywood was making the same mistakes as old Hollywood, allowing for excess both on and off screen. The box office failure of these three films, along with the enormous box office takings of Star Wars and Jaws, marked the end of the New Hollywood cycle and a mainstream cinema that was targeted solely at the teenage market, which I assume we'll discuss more in the 80s episodes.
So yeah, I think this is probably going to be one of the more
contentious
podcasts with a few interesting
divisive
podcast.
Maybe we should say how we vote for these things. So we have a top 10, each of us has a top 10, and number 1 gets 10 points on the list and number 10 gets 1 point. So that means that sometimes, especially as we get into the later decades, there's not a great deal of crossover. So some of us really don't like the films on this list.
And we shall discover who they are as this continues.
Yeah. Talking of which, when a film gets brought up.
Talking of which, let's see if you're watching this, if you can tell by people's faces when I say the name. Think of it. First up is Taxi Driver.
So Taxi Driver is about a character called Travis Bickle, who is possibly a Vietnam War veteran. He possibly works for the government in his spare time. But what we definitely know is that he struggles to sleep. And to cope with his insomnia, he takes on a job as a taxi driver, which allows him to see the underbelly of New York. And we see the underbelly of New York via the impressions that he gives us in his diary. And he becomes obsessed and fixated on certain aspects of New York, particularly its criminal underworld. And in a bid to find meaning in his life, he attempts to save a very young child prostitute, and it's not going to go well.
Hilarity ensues.
Hilarity ensues. It's a jape. It's a jape.
It's a black comedy.
Oh yeah. So this was
Some
on
of it is.
this was on 2 of our lists, and 2 of our lists it wasn't. So let's start with let's start with Dawn.
Yeah. So I guess it's a film I have a lot of nostalgia for, having watched it a lot when I was just getting into films. So I do find it quite difficult to give an objective opinion on it. Even though it'd been quite a while since I watched it, I still remembered the bits in it that I used to really like. But I think I did see some of it in a kind of different way, and maybe felt like I understood it a bit better now. I kind of felt a lot more aware of being sucked into it, like through the narration and the music, which feels like quite a dangerous thing to do. Like it has these kind of funny, lighter moments in it, but I find it's also very easy to take it too seriously, which I guess is what makes it interesting. Like it's good at making you see his perspective, that it feels like it's pulling you towards this darkness, that I felt like I had to keep resisting it. So it's definitely very effective in what it's trying to do in that sense. I also felt very quick this time watching it. Like it kind of starts quite slow and builds, and then it was the last scene, and I was like, oh, I thought there was a lot more going on, and it was over. Yeah. So I don't know. I just can't stop thinking about how I used to feel about it. So
I think that's a brilliant summation, actually, because the idea of it drawing you in to this incredibly, what is quite a deranged sensibility of this fantasist, is part of the appeal I find in it. I've written quite a bit of it on it. I've written quite a few comments.
You wrote quite a bit.
I wrote a bit of it.
Paul.
Speaking of delusions. No, I've written quite a bit on it, sorry. And what really fascinates me about it is this very troubled protagonist and how the city mimics his viewpoint. And what fascinates me even more is that New York at the time was incredibly crime-addled and was very, very troubled. So that really the city streets, they didn't have to like set dress anything like they did in particular. For instance, in Joker, they've got these garbage bags piled up in Joker that look like they cost about $500,000. And in Taxi Driver, there just happened to be a garbage strike on at the time, so they wrote it into the script so that it would fit in with the logic of the film. But this sort of garbage and this fantastical ephemera and this ugliness that is building up in Travis Bickle's life is mirrored by the city around him, which I find really just compelling. And yeah,
isn't it interesting that quite a lot of the films that we've watched have the city almost as a character in the film? I feel like throughout the podcast, really from kind of the 20s onwards, we've always had at least one film where the city is a really strong character within the film.
Yeah.
For me, it's not a particularly complex viewpoint, which is that I can see it's masterfully made, masterfully acted, and a wonderful film. It's just not the kind of film I would personally choose to watch. I don't know how much I love being drawn into that sleazy underworld, particularly. Having said that, it is effective because it makes me uncomfortable and it puts me ill at ease. There are a lot of things I really do like about it. I like films that have kind of almost an unreliable narrator, and I think it's one of the best at that. And De Niro is like absolutely amazing in it. He's probably, quite possibly, the best De Niro performance for me. It wouldn't have made my list, but I have no real argument with it making the list because I can see that it's a brilliant film, but it's just not for me. So my summary isn't particularly complex, but then we'll go to Chris.
The nihilism of the entire thing, just really, it doesn't really gel with me. I understand why the film is written in such a way. I understand that they're trying to get inside the head of this guy, but it's just not something that I find very it's a film that makes me feel like just depressed, but not in a constructive way, not in a way where I go, oh, I feel like I got a really artistic experience that made me like understand things more. I just like, it doesn't really like click with me. I do feel that sometimes there's like a lack of distance between what his point is and the like style that he portrays it with. Me and Joel were talking about this in terms of like Wolf of Wall Street, right? Which is obviously a far worse film than Taxi Driver. And
it's a very different film as well.
Yeah, but I think there it's very like, there is a big problem in the film in that it's like, oh, this person is bad, but it glorifies him to the extent that like it doesn't ring true. And I think for me, Taxi Driver sits on the edge of that, and I can understand why most people who like it would say, oh, I don't buy that criticism.
You know, a lot of people have that criticism of it, and a lot of reviewers at the time had that criticism of it. And of course, as I'm sure everyone knows, the film was linked to an attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, which is something that happens in the film. And so there are clearly very ill people who did find this idea of a sort of lone gunman very appealing. I don't know if that means that you should create a film with strict moral boundaries in order to dissuade those people. I'm not sure that's the responsibility of art, personally. But I think that it feels like a bit like saying Trainspotting glamorizes heroin use. Like he lives in this ugly, downtrodden apartment. He doesn't speak to anyone. He can't communicate with anyone in any real way. He tries to, Sybil Shepherd's character, when he tries to date her, she's partly a device of the film to just show how alien his perspective is to other people. When he takes her to a porn theatre about a quarter of the way into the film, which is probably one of the more blackly comic parts of the film. He goes, no, couples come to this all the time, and it's this horrible porn show. I mean, I think that it's a horrible, depraved film that is attempting to show someone who is reaching a 0 point in the pursuit of meaning. When you get to the end point, it's not in keeping with the rest of the film, which is quite grounded in realism. So you can say it's either a filmic interpretation of a redemption arc, or it's a violent piece of exploitation that doesn't fit in with the film. I would say it's kind of the former, in that it does kind of redeem him, but it redeems him via his skewed logic, because we're deep in his head by that point.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable interpretation. So Schrader, about writing the ending, said it's not to be taken as a dream sequence. It should be envisioned as a returning to the beginning of the film, as if the last frame could be spliced into the first frame and the movie starts all over again. Dawn, what do you think about that?
That sounds good. I do like it when that happens in films. The start is the end.
I suppose in that sense you're taking it like he's on this endless cycle, isn't he?
Yeah.
Like it's never cured by any means.
I think Schrader was also talking about how he kind of creates his own loneliness a lot of the time, that he puts himself in these situations which push people further away without him even realizing it. So he kind of has to get away from that to even get out of that cycle. Yeah,
start to move forwards in any way, shape or form. Don, do you have any fun facts on Taxi Driver?
Yeah, so Bernard Herrmann died shortly after the final scoring session for the film, which I guess relates to the fact that we talked about for Citizen Kane, because that was his first film that he scored, and this was his last film that he scored.
There you go, we've gone cyclical. I completely
Interesting.
Yeah.
I have a fun fact.
Go on then.
Many reviewers, thought Robert De Niro was too handsome to play a psychopath in Taxi Driver. They thought he was far too good looking.
Because you don't get handsome psychopaths, of course.
Yeah. I don't know, because he is, to me, he's very convincing. And he looks quite malnourished and whatnot. But yeah, reviewers thought he was way too good looking at the time.
Because they originally wanted Jack Nicholson, didn't they? I think.
Really? I didn't know
right?
that. Oh.
I made that.
Apparently, Paul Schrader wrote the part with Jeff Bridges in mind.
Jeff Bridges in mind. What?
I'm glad Paul Schrader didn't get to direct it then.
No.
Yes.
I wouldn't like to see either Jeff Bridges or Jack Nicholson playing Travis Bickle particularly.
Mm.
I think it's one of those ones where you can only quite often with these you can imagine someone else playing it. Travis Bickle, I don't think you can imagine any other actor playing it now. It's kind of become so iconic and so part of like cinema history that it's almost impossible to think of someone else playing that role now.
I think more than that, I think the collaboration between Schrader and Scorsese and De Niro feels quite iconic, and I hate that word iconic actually, but it feels very sort of much like if one element of that was removed, then the film wouldn't really work.
So let's summarize then why we'll sort of start with Chris and move back to it. Why do we think of the positives, Chris. Well, what parts of Taxi Driver do you really like?
That's put me on the spot there because I'm like I think I like the idea behind Taxi Driver. I like what it's attempt. I think my problem with Taxi Driver is that like when I read about the intentions of it and when I see what like people say about it, I go, isn't that an amazing movie? And I wish that I got what you and Don get out of it, like Kev.
Anybody who knows me probably wouldn't expect Taxi Driver to be necessarily my kind of film. I can still I watch it and I can still see that for the type of film it is, it's absolutely masterful. Like it's incredibly well directed, it's incredibly well acted. The script is pretty much spot on. Yeah, I mean, my views on Taxi Driver are really quite boring. It's really good. It's just not my kind of film. So I'd probably move straight on to Kev or Don there, whoever wants to jump in.
I going back to kind of what we were saying before, I guess. I like that it feels like it could only been made at that exact time and that place with those people. And I really enjoy the feeling of watching it, I guess. Like it's kind of mesmerizing in a way, and the score is incredible, and it looks beautiful. And I love a lot of the shots in it and the slow-mo that I think make it really effective and disturbing as well. And I love Albert Briggs' character in it.
Yeah.
And Kev?
Yeah, I love it. I think it captures the inherent violence and depression of New York at the time when it was filmed, which it was a city with a huge murder rate and a huge crime rate. So I think you're right to find it very depressing, Chris, because it was about a time that was very depressing in that city's lifespan.
So yeah, the next film that has made it onto the list is The Heartbreak Kid. Again, quite a divisive one. Don, do you want to summarize this one?
Yeah, okay. So the film starts with this couple getting together and they kind of rush into getting married, and they go off on their honeymoon to Miami, and on the journey, Charles Grodin, who plays the guy, he kind of starts to realize that he's maybe made a horrible mistake as he gradually begins to find a lot of the things that his new wife does quite annoying, even though maybe they're not annoying, maybe it's more his problem. But over the course of the journey, it starts to kind of wear him down and question his decision. And then the next day they go to the beach and he spots Sybil Shepherd, and I think he kind of finds her really attractive and mesmerizing, and his wife gets sunburned on the beach, so he sees it as a perfect opportunity to kind of pursue the new love of his life, and hilarity ensues and awkwardness ensues.
Is it happy then sad?
It's happy and then sad and then the end.
So for me, Heartbreak Kid, it's another one of those the time period in my life I watched it. So it probably kind of stands out for me and possibly Don in a way that maybe it doesn't for Kev or Chris in this regard. For me, like, I'm a huge fan of cringe humor and awkward humor. Again, that's totally not for everyone, but For me, that's kind of the funniest form of humor. So I love that about it. I also love like the kind of criticism of the American dream. I think is great, and this whole idea of and this need that we all have to treat people as property, and also this idea of like this whole idea of never ever being satisfied. Quite. I don't want to say it appeals to me because it doesn't appeal to me, but it's an idea that I think works really well in this.
Yeah, I think I've seen it a couple of times before this, but I think this time was the most I've enjoyed it, I think, and everything felt even more painful and hilarious and absurd in a way, and the tragedy and the awkwardness of most of the situations in it is so intense that it turns into comedy. So I guess if that kind of humor isn't your thing, then you probably won't enjoy it that much. But yeah, again, I do really like that kind of thing anyway. I think I like it. It doesn't really overplay any of the comedy in it. It like sometimes feels excruciatingly drawn out, but it never feels exaggerated. And what I remember about the remake, it kind of does. The
remake is one of my least favourite films of all time.
Yeah, it kind of does overplay everything in that one. So yeah, I think the less is definitely more in it, and the kind of documentary feel it sometimes has also plays into that idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Charles Grodin's really great in it. And he kind of makes this really unlikable character not any more likable, but I don't know, you don't hate him in a way that you maybe should because he is kind of, I don't know, I guess so. Yeah, he does it with such sincerity.
Yeah. Okay, Chris.
So sorry, I was just looking at something. Can you remind? Okay. No, I was trying to remember. Is it Sybil Shepherd?
Yeah, we've got a Sybil Shepherd marathon this week.
Yeah, I was trying to look up her name to make sure I didn't make a mistake. But yeah, so I think my main issue with the Heartbreak Kid is that I think you and Dawn like find it very funny. And my main issue is that I think that it's a fairly well constructed film. I enjoy the sort of dramatic arc of this guy who thinks that he thinks he's like amazing, and he thinks that he deserves everything, and he's gonna be as sleazy and slimy and like manipulative to get what he wants because he thinks that he deserves the best of everything, and he's like willing to fuck over anyone, like including his own wife, because he's like, well, like I obviously deserve better than you because I'm so amazing. I enjoy his dramatic arc, especially towards the end of the film, like the last scene. But like Dawn, you mentioned that you thought that it doesn't overplay the comedy, but I almost think it underplays it. Because I'm not a huge person for like cringe comedy, but when I say that, I mean normally I watch things that are very cringe comedy, and then it's like too cringy, and I'm like, oh my god, like it's almost like the humor's too much for me. But I never really got that with this. It was more just it was a very light drama piece to me because I didn't find it very funny, like at all, at any point. And this is so that it's like obviously like that doesn't end up being a very strong or interesting criticism because humor is so subjective that it's like you can't really say why you found something funny or why you didn't. But I think that it didn't quite connect with me just because I just didn't find it very funny. My other problem, which maybe like one of you two can kind of counteract, was that I thought that Sybil Shepherd is kind of hard done by in the film, because the whole kind of point of like her character being there is so that he can view her in a certain way, and I just think that she doesn't really get like much of a personality built into her. I think you quite often see her from his perspective, without really exploring what's going on inside her head at all. Which, considering that the film is kind of critiquing that, didn't really sit with me that well. But
I'll happily
I do think it's well made, and I really like Charles Grodin in it. So, which
I'll come back on all
I
those
think Kev is about to disagree with.
Like I say, I'll come back on those points, but I want to go to Kev first to see what his thinking is.
Well, you know, I hate saying this, but I almost agree with Chris. It's yeah. I mean, apparently I watched it 10 years ago. I don't really remember. I watched it around Joel's house, and apparently I found it funny 10 years ago. And I've got no memory of it. I think I watched it, and then maybe I was just being polite because I was around Joel's house. I don't know. But yeah, I watched it again this week with no real memory of it. But having seen other Elaine May films, and I really love A New Leaf, I think that's exceptionally funny. And I think Ishtar's really good as well. But yeah, it didn't do anything for me, really. Charles Grodin, I'm sort of underwhelmed by. I think Sybil Shepherd is fine enough in what she's doing. There's one or two lines I think are good. Which is, I like he refers to cauliflower as deceitful at one point, and that really made me laugh. I think the idea of cauliflower as deceitful is brilliant. And there's a bit where his wife, who is sort of a pain in the arse, to be honest, I can see he's made a mistake there. But she gets really badly sunburned and puts lots of after sun lotion on her, and it's really lumpy and horrible. And she says, "I've put on some cream," and it's so self-explanatory. It made me laugh a lot. And it didn't have much propulsion for me, really. In the way that a farce should build on its elements, it felt like it just repeated the same element over and over.
But on a few of those things, Chris, when you were talking about Grodin's character, you were saying that he thinks he should just get whatever he wants. I'm not really sure that I necessarily agree with that. I think it's a film about like kind of perennial dissatisfaction with your lot, rather than thinking that you should be able to get everything. I think it's a film about how we, as generally as a society, but certainly men quite often, are completely dissatisfied with their lot and always looking for the next thing. And I don't really necessarily think that's about him thinking he deserves the next thing. I think it's no matter what he gets, he'll always be dissatisfied with what he's got. And that's, you know, that's why I partly talk about the American dream as well, because that's all this whole idea of if you work hard, you'll achieve your goal and you'll get what you want. And it's just not necessarily the case, because he's been led to believe that by society, by his upbringing, whatever. But he will always be dissatisfied with what he's got, regardless. Come back on Sybil Shepherd, because I know that you said you wanted me or Dawn to come back on that.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with how, like, what she does in the film. I just kind of wish she had a bit more to her, like more kind of.
I think the idea
meat on the bone,
actually,
which it would be a very awkward way of saying it.
I think the idea is that they shouldn't put too much to her, because no matter what, he's seeing what he wants to see in that character. If you put more to her, then there's a reason why he gets with her. In this, there's the idea that he gets with her is just that he's completely dissatisfied with his lot. And so it could have been anyone. It's not that she's his dream woman. It's that he marries someone who's perfectly nice, but they're too young, and it's probably, or she's too young, and it's probably not for them. So he's always looking for the next thing. As soon as he gets with Sybil Shepherd, he's sitting at the end, he's sitting at this wedding, realizes he doesn't fit in with her family whatsoever, and he's dissatisfied with that now. So it doesn't really matter who she is. She's actually quite a vapid persona in the film, and I think that's the point.
It kind of reminded me of The Graduate, like the end of it, and that way it's kind of like the thrill of the chase, and then at the end he kind of realizes once he's got it, like that's it. It wasn't. He wants, it's going to be doing it all over again. Yeah,
exactly, yeah. It's this idea that he's sitting there, the whole rich family are completely ignoring him. And he's sitting having to talk to the kids. The kids don't care. Even the kids are wandering away from him at this point. But yeah, let's, Dawn, have you got any fun facts on Heartbreak?
Oh, yeah. So the girl that plays Lila is Elaine May's daughter.
Oh.
And according to Charles Grodin's autobiography, Neil Simon repeatedly asked for her to be replaced because he didn't think she was pretty enough, not realizing that she was Elaine May's daughter.
Jesus.
And it was nominated for 2 Oscars in the supporting actor categories. And Jerry Seinfeld considered it the greatest comedy of all time.
There you go. I hate Jerry Seinfeld as well. So
I don't know if that's praise or not, really.
See, I love Seinfeld, but I think it kind of makes the humor. It kind of takes the same sort of thing of like a really horrible person, and making horrible decisions, and that's where the humor comes from. But I think it's a bit more intense. It's a bit more.
I don't like
it.
Seinfeld because I find the comedy too broad. Like I find it.
I think that this film doesn't play up enough. I agree with Kev that it never gets to the point where it's a lot of very mildly awkward situations where he's a dick, but it never quite builds enough to the point where I find it that funny.
See, I find it probably the cringiest film ever made, personally. So I like.
It does nothing for me.
Well, I think I suppose the discussion as well is like what we talked about. Comedy is so subjective. So.
Well, you know what? I do think there are a few scenes I quite like. I think there's a point at which Charles Grodin and Sybil Shepherd, quite near the end, have to strip off, and it's by firelight, and it's this sort of childish game that's adds a sexual frisson. And I think that's very well shot. I think ELAINE May is generally good with actors, so even though I'm not a big fan of Charles Grodin, I think he does an okay job. There's one or two lines I enjoyed, but the humour is very much not for me, and I don't think it has enough build to give a sort of farcical quality that it seems to be trying to attain.
Chris?
Yeah, so I think my issue with it is more the fact that it's on the best of the decade rather than any kind of issue with it as a film. Like, I actually quite enjoyed watching it. I had quite a good time watching it. I just felt like, even with the fact that I didn't find it very funny, I found like the performances quite enjoyable, and I found like the sort of dramatic arc quite interesting. So it felt just like quite a slight but enjoyable drama to me. So I would, like, if somebody's got a free afternoon, I wouldn't say that you could do worse than watch it, but it just didn't hit me with any kind of great power.
For once, for me, I find myself agreeing with Jerry Seinfeld, which I don't.
Yeah.
I know, I don't like that. I think for me, it probably is. It might be the funniest comedy ever made for me. I laugh the entire way through it, quite often cry with laughter. I cringe, I squirm, I hide behind a cushion, even though I've seen it about 20 times now. I think Charles Grodin is phenomenal in it. I think it's a really funny, awkward performance, and yeah, I think the dynamics between all of the characters and the message that the film ultimately has, I think, are really strong. What about you, Dawn?
Yeah, I think Charles Grodin is pretty great in it too. I think he's maybe quite underrated as a comedic actor. Like, he tends to be seen as a kind of backup person to a lot of bigger people, but I don't know, I think he carries this pretty well. I do like how it kind of captures that absurdity of relationships, or maybe more specifically marriage, and where people can commit to each other forever without really knowing the other person. And like, when they're on their honeymoon, they're surrounded by all these old couples reminding them of their future, and there's some there that dress alike as well. Like, it's some kind of strange nightmare relationship. And yeah, I guess as well what John was saying about that people aren't willing to work at things anymore and have patience and understanding towards each other. I think it totally nails that as well, and it's really funny.
Yeah,
everyone should watch it.
Cool. So the third film that we've picked this week is Celine and Julie Go Boating. Celine and Julie Go Boating is a Jacques Rivette film, and it follows Celine and Julie on a series of adventures. It's a 3.5 hour roughly long film. The first half of the film basically deals with Celine and Julie moving in with each other, and it's quite sort of slow paced and feels a bit more like a kind of almost like a French realist film with some really odd moments in it. The second half becomes sort of kind of magical and in it they both find themselves transported to this house, which has a kind of old feel to it. And there's a mystery element that they've got to try and solve. They keep finding themselves kicked out of the house and with a little sweetie that they've got to suck on that reveals more and more and more about the mystery until they try and solve it.
Yeah, it's interesting because both times I've watched it, I've thought whilst watching it that it's kind of decent but not amazing, and then by the end I'm left feeling like it might have been genius, but in a way that's quite hard to articulate to someone that hasn't gone through the experience of watching it. In a way, like I think it does take a little while to get into, and it kind of feels like a puzzle that you don't have all the pieces to, which can be a bit frustrating at first, considering the length of it. And it's kind of hard to know what elements are important until you see the bigger picture. But there's always something intriguing about it that I think makes you want to keep watching it.
Yeah.
What I like about it.
And Kev?
Yeah, I think it's an exceptional film. I think that it's very funny, which hasn't been brought up yet. And at times, especially during the first maybe hour and a half or so, there are these sort of long goers where things go on for an incredibly long period of time. And it feels like a Stuart Lee joke. It's like at the start, you go, huh, and then it keeps going, and you find it funny that it's kept going. And then you get quite bored, and you go, why is this still going? And then somehow it comes back around, and you start laughing again, because you're amazed that it's kept going this long. And then you're bored again, and then you find it funny again. And it finds these strange peaks and troughs that very few films manage to find, because it's got this commitment and this bravery of vision and confidence of vision, where it says things are going to kind of last a little while longer, and we're going to find new elements and new kind of textures for every kind of minute that this goes on for. So I find that very enjoyable, and the central Celine and Julie are really charming characters, really funny, and really just you kind of are quite happy to be around. And then it moves into this period drama, almost out of nowhere, and becomes a sort of almost entirely different film, but with Celine and Julie sort of bolstering it all and giving it a thread that you can kind of support. So it's got a sort of feel a bit like Daisies to me. Feels like Daisies 2, for anyone who watched the 1960s podcast. I've said that to wind up Chris partly. Blood is about to boil.
Yeah. So for me, I agree with what both of you have said. I think, quite honestly, like I could sit with those two characters for longer than the time period that the film lasts for, because they're just so pleasant to be around. And yeah, you enjoy the first half. The way I see it, the first half is kind of getting to know those characters and exploring their dynamics with each other. And then the second half takes you into this whole other world that they're transported into, and they're having to explore at the same time as you are. So I think it's quite an interesting way of dealing with that. I'd like to go over to Chris because he looks like he's going to kill someone just now.
It's why is it 3.25 hours long? It's so boring. I would like to. I was kind of thinking while some of you were talking about what you liked about it, and I do kind of vaguely agree with Kev in his point about Daisies, because the elements that I like about it is their relationship, and I like the sort of playfulness about narrative that comes in the second half. And what I would like is if that was the entire film, and it was, instead of having these jokes where, as you said, they are funny to begin with and then they go on, but they never came back around to being funny for me. So it was just like, and then they go on while they're more boring, and then they become even more boring, and they never let anything go. And then the two main characters keep giggling about something which isn't funny for like ages. And so it's like, what I would like is I'd like to watch like a recut version of this that is maybe 1 hour long, and cuts out all the like long stuff where nothing happens.
You mean character development?
No, I mean nothing happens. It's like just incredibly long bits. And also, this is my other problem with it, is that I think it's an incredibly visually flat film. I find it very, it kind of reminds me of the like very ugly movies that Godard makes in the 80s, which I am a huge fan of either, which are these like just very like, there's no depth to most of the shots, and like there's not a huge amount of interesting lighting going on.
Can I point out? Can I point out, Chris, just before, because I know what you mean, but that is deliberate from Godard.
No.
You've made it sound like a mistake that he's made.
No, I think that it's deliberate. I just don't like it.
That's fair enough, but
yeah, and I think that it's like, it's kind of in the way that like if you look at something like David Lynch, and he's got performances that are extremely unnatural, and if you like that sort of thing, you're like, these are hilarious and brilliant, and I totally like get into it. But the film, to me, because I don't buy into the aesthetic, just feels very, very visually flat to me. And so I think perhaps the runtime would be justified if it was like this beautiful film. But instead, it just feels as though you're watching, like, it feels very realist to me. Like Joel was saying, like the first half is like almost like a realist drama. But like in terms of like the shooting style, it's very realist. And it doesn't excite me, and it makes me go, you know, when similar ideas were played with, but quicker, with more interesting characters and better, like, and more exciting visuals, maybe I'll just watch that again instead.
Yeah, I guess I can see what you mean, that like the colors they're not really bright and bold, maybe. They are kind of, maybe they're colourful but a bit more muted maybe. And because it's not really over the top and kind of zany when it gets to that other world, maybe I can see why maybe if it was like that, it would maybe appeal to you a bit more if there was some kind of big change. But I guess it is more about like how the characters can stay with you, or like a story can stay with you after watching a film, and how it doesn't necessarily have to be like a really crazy film. It can just be people walking about talking, how that can stay on with you afterwards. So that's why maybe necessarily doesn't have to be a really big crazy thing that happens.
Kev?
Well, I can see what Chris is saying to an extent. I think that it's not a lush epic three and a quarter hour film at all. It is designed to look a bit realist, which isn't Chris's favourite look. But I think you've got this sort of drab landscape where they're not really getting treated very well by their bosses, and they're living in a slightly strange scenario. And there's just like a slightly humdrum existence that they live that's punctuated by moments of oddness that then transports into this much stranger variation in the last half of the film. And yeah, aesthetically, I don't really have a problem with that. I think if you really go against any kind of realist idea and you only want lush visuals and mad cutting, then yeah, this isn't the film for you.
There's an interesting thing with, and I hadn't probably quite picked up on this before, and this is still going to be a half thought out thing, but it's interesting how it plays with characterization, is that nobody is ever quite what they seem. So like Celine will impersonate Julie sometimes, Julie will impersonate Celine sometimes throughout the film. When they go into the sort of more period drama element, all of the other characters kind of shift about quite often, and the way they're played quite often shifts about. Sometimes Celine and Julie are almost in the head of one of those characters. So it's like, it's got a really interesting way of playing about with characters. I'd like to go to Chris and see what you thought about that, or if you had any thoughts on that.
Again, I think it's more like, I really like, when I think about it, and I think about, there's these scenes in which they are half playing a character and half being themselves playing a character, and like partly they've like they're partly believing the role that they're in, and they're partly kind of just playing it up for like a laugh. To me, when I say that out loud, I think that sounds amazing, and it sounds really funny and really enjoyable. But it's just, I don't know, there's just something about it that just doesn't click with me. And so I think maybe if it was it was directed by somebody else and was shorter, I think I would really enjoy. I'd really want to see a remake of this film. That's what I think, though. Is I think that like what it's trying to do.
Can I point out, Chris? Every one of your criticisms for each of these films has been, I would like them to be a different film.
Well, I think I think it's more. I really like the themes that this is playing with, but not the execution.
Again, I'd go back and say partly I expected you to really love this film, but then when I think about it, similar to me with Taxi Driver, I can't really critique your opinion, because anyone who knows you knows you're probably not going to like the kind of more realist aesthetic of it as well. So it's a bit of a... If we go to Don or Chris on what do you think of like the characterizations and the playfulness with character, because it's not something that's that commonly done in a lot of films, like that real playful touch with the sort of personas of the characters.
Did you name Don or Kevin there?
Yeah, I'll say it again if you want.
You just called me Chris.
Did I? Oh, that's because you've agreed on so many things this time. Don, let's go to Don.
Yeah, it's kind of like this idea of transformation to figuratively and literally being in someone else's shoes, because a couple of times they do swap shoes, don't they? And I guess that was also explored in Desperately Seeking Susan, which was inspired by it. So maybe, Chris, have you seen Desperately Seeking Susan?
I've not. Maybe I'll watch it.
That would be your remake of this film that you will love, I think.
It sort of keys into this Alice in Wonderland idea, which is directly inspired by Alice in Wonderland, but this idea that you just take certain things and you change into a different person, and your physicality can change and your mind can change. And yeah, it's sort of very formalist in that sense, and it's just a sort of experimentation about the unknowability of humanity.
Don, have you got any fun facts about Celine and Julie?
So Jacques Rivette's involvement in the writing of the film was to give structure to what the actors wrote, because a lot of the actors kind of wrote scenes for the film, and he kind of put them together and helped bring it into the whole thing. And there's only one scene in it which was improvised.
Which scene is it? You know,
I think it's kind of where there's like the table with a lot of people around it, and they're kind of, I think it's CELINE, is it? Kind of discussing that she's kind of met someone exciting or whatever, and they kind of have a little chat about it. She kind of make some stuff up.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So let's summarize then. Why do we all like, or in this case, utterly despise Celine? Again, let's start with Chris. Try and pick out some things you like.
I think I'll go. I think I was maybe a bit harsh on Taxi Driver earlier, because this really is the film where I want to go. I really like the ideas behind it. When I first heard about this film, I thought that's going to be a film for me. That's going to be a film that I'll love, because I love playfulness in sort of narrative. I love sort of experimenting with different kind of ways of telling a story. I think just for me, it's more interested in structurally experimenting than be like visual experimentation. And so for me, it's not really my sort of thing. I would, again, recommend watching Daisies from last time, because I think that, as Kev says, there are a lot of similarities between the two of them, and Daisies is like this, but better, you know.
Kev?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful film. As I said, I watched it in a busy screening, and it was given a very warm reception and was deemed to be very, very funny. And it makes me laugh pretty consistently. And I do enjoy, maybe this probably isn't Chris's type of humour, I enjoy a very long, drawn-out joke that goes on for too long. That is one of my favourite kinds of jokes. I think that the way that it uses the Alice in Wonderland idea of people sort of morphing into each other is compelling. I find Celine and Julie to be very charming company, which is half the battle in a sort of 3.25 hour surrealist epic. So yeah, it's very enjoyable. Yeah.
Don?
Yeah, I think I kind of like that Jacques Rivette's films are so stubbornly long. I like that they kind of take their time and meander, and that it kind of has a better handle on how things unfold over 3 or 4 hours than a lot of directors do over 90 minutes. And that his mind works in such sweeping slices of time that somehow create very specific feelings that maybe more concentrated films don't achieve. That means that it's really good to think about afterwards. I like how the characters in the film go from being viewed by us to becoming viewers themselves, whilst also still being viewing. That's like a comment on voyeurism, which is also brought up by Julie at one point when she's on the stage. And yeah, I like that it feels like a celebration of kind of escapism and the magic of cinema.
Yeah. You just come to me and I can just say what she said.
Yeah.
Was a pretty great summary of it. Also, I really like films that are about or exploring time. I think Celine and Julie's a really, really good one for that. You're both exploring the present and the past. You're both exploring the weird way in which time passes in an almost like dreamlike way. And I really like how that unravels. And it's also, you could also say, like, because it's a really long film, you're also exploring time in that way. So no, I really like that about it. Yeah. So the fourth film we're going to discuss this week is Girlfriends. Who wants to do the summary of Girlfriends?
I'm happy to, Joe.
Are you? Great. Okay, go ahead.
So, Girlfriends is about two women who live together at the start of the film. One is an aspiring photographer, the other is an aspiring writer. The aspiring writer then gets hitched. She's set to be married, she moves out, and she begins living a new life. She disappears from the narrative for quite a while. The aspiring photographer doesn't quite know what to do. She's a bit aimless living alone, but eventually her career begins to pick up. And because she has had a reasonably solitary existence and a youthful existence of singledom, she is able to progress in her career. The married woman is always aspiring to write, but now she's got a kid, and her husband, who seems perfectly nice, is still sort of a 70s man who kind of constricts her quite a lot. As the film progresses, the photographer is increasing in her success, but now has a boyfriend, and he wants to sort of lock her down, in the parlance of our times, and would like to move in, and she can see that as being a place that she can't escape from.
Did we all rewatch Girlfriends this time around? Yeah.
I watched it for the first time.
So that's a good starting point then. What were your thoughts?
I thought it was very charming. I thought that I wanted to say the main two leads, but there's really sort of one main lead character. And she is extremely well acted and sort of well characterized. I think that a lot of the experiences that she goes through the film, because she's sort of an aspiring artist, are quite relatable, and also the sort of parts in the film where she's like trying to get ahead in her life, where it seems as though other people are sort of doing stuff, and then you see that actually the stuff that they're doing isn't making them as happy as she thinks they are, but like she doesn't know that, I think is an interesting sort of commentary on how I think people view relationships, because she thinks, oh, like my friend has betrayed me to go off and be perfectly happy in this relationship, and then you see that she really isn't. I think it's I think it's quite an interesting film in sort of the character relations and portraying people in quite a realistic way. And it's quite funny as well.
It is, yeah. And Don?
Yeah, I've seen it a couple of times now, and I guess this time around watching it, I was kind of more aware of how ahead of its time it was, I think. The first time I watched it, I was more aware of the TV show Girls, so I maybe didn't realise as much. It kind of, I don't know, but having not seen Girls for a while, watching it seemed to be, a lot of it stood out, like, wow, can't believe they were doing this in the 70s. For a woman that, being the main character and kind of instigating one-night stands and having an affair with a rabbi and it kind of deals with abortion as well. It kind of seems almost impossible to imagine in American cinema like 10 or 20 years previously. I feel like most of it's dated quite well. And I really like the main character, Susan. I think she's really interesting and funny and talented. And it's really enjoyable to see her navigating her way through life, even though things don't always work out. It's kind of the adventurism of putting herself out there that helps her develop as a character, even if it is in quite subtle ways.
It seems to be a film that's had kind of quite a lot of influence without maybe getting that much recognition along the way, which is quite interesting. Like, I would say Frances Ha, for example, is basically a direct remake of Girlfriends in a lot of ways. Like, there's really a number of scenes throughout Frances Ha that are directly lifted from Girlfriends, including kind of the sort of ending scene is very, very similar. But yeah, for me, I agree with what everyone said. I think the characterizations are really strong, and I think this portrayal of like nobody's perfect in it. Like every single character is extremely imperfect, and that makes it quite easy to associate with because you can sort of find yourself or find someone you know in a lot of the characters. And it's also interesting seeing Christopher Guest randomly playing the boyfriend of Susan's character, which I hadn't realized until I watched it this time around. I'm like, that's Christopher Guest, okay, weird. But I think the characterizations are strong. I think actually like the direction, while it's not showy, I think it's incredibly well directed. There's never really a misplaced shot. There's never a scene that you could really cut out of it or anything that feels like filler particularly. I think it's a really strongly directed film and a really sharp script actually. It feels very, very, like you say, it does feel very, very modern. But it is, it's funny throughout. And again, it does have like some of those like cringy, awkward moments that I quite like, but they're very real. And in some ways, like it's kind of heartbreaking at times because you really feel for both of the sort of female leads in the film. And I think, for that, it really does stand out because I don't think you see a lot of films that portray it in quite the same way. What about you, Kev?
Good. Yeah, I like it. It's a brilliant sort of emotional deep dive into one woman's sort of 20-year-old life, 20-something-year-old life. And the comparisons with Girls and Frances Ha are very pertinent. And I think that the real differences between those two films is that Melanie Marin is the main actor, which I only know because I googled it right there. But she's exceptional. She's a very charismatic performer, and again, a bit like Celine and Julie Goldboy, she's kind of great to be around. Like you kind of want her to be your pal a bit, which just gives the film an inherent likability. But I think that you don't necessarily know her class, and Frances Ha. A criticism that was levelled at it at the time was that it felt like a very upper middle class existence. Mm-hmm. So while I like that film, it was occasionally very difficult to empathise with Greta Gerwig's character because her situation had no crisis to it. And Girls is very similar in that sense. There's no real crisis. It's sort of just this existential aimlessness. Whereas in Girlfriends, Melanie Marin's character, her electric goes, well, our gas goes off, as they say in America, like all our electricity just goes off at one point, and you see there's a real financial imperative to her succeeding, and she might actually have to go and get a proper job at some point, which would kill her career, you know. And you also realise that she needs this independence to be successful. So although moving in with her boyfriend would cut her outgoings in half, she resists it because she knows it's a prison and she can see what's happened to her friend. And there's all these great psychological studies that give it a lot more depth than something like Girls of Frances Ha. But it's got a really light touch, and it's really funny, and it's just got a lot of little charming elements. And it feels a bit, although it feels timeless, it's also a great time capsule, because there's brilliant bits where she goes hitchhiking at one point. She just jumps in someone's car and then has a flat share with a girl who she meets in the back of someone's car. And there's all little strange bits we watch and go, Jesus, that would not even seem feasible in a film now, for a film that's clearly rooted in a sense of realism about New York at the time. So yeah, no, I love it. It's really good. Yeah.
What do you think about this like, that it tackles some quite serious issues, but with a kind of light touch, which I think in a lot of ways makes it, I don't know, like the discussions around, like you're saying, like the affair and discussions around abortion and things like that, I think they're done in a way that like takes away the taboo from these types of things, and I think that's a really great thing as well. But I do like that the whole film deals with these some quite serious issues. And what did you think of that, Chris? Like the kind of light touch in serious issues.
I was trying to think there, because I was like, a lot of the issues are things happen and then they kind of get brushed away very quickly. And I think that actually I was like, is that something that I liked or disliked? And I think that it kind of works in the film's favor, because it means it doesn't like it doesn't feel like one of those films where it's like one event defines this person. Like it's a film about this one issue and it's like trying to really like get its teeth into this. It's more a portrait of like of the main character, and these are things that would happen to someone who was in that situation. So it's more about her and focusing on like her as a person, rather than being like, oh, and this is the film about having an affair with a rabbi, but like having an affair with a married man. It's like, that isn't like the focus. It's just like, these are a set of things that would happen to someone in this situation, and she is the focus, which I think that really sort of works in the film's favor. It kind of makes it more of a genuine film rather than like an issue film.
Yeah, I like this idea that nobody's defined by nobody's defined by their, you could say, mistakes or by their choices. They're just people, and I like that.
Kubrick was a big fan of it, and he mentioned liking that over, like when he was asked about looking in New Hollywood and stuff, what films and filmmakers he liked, and he didn't mention Scorsese or Spielberg. He said Girlfriends is really exciting. When
you guys, I think this was on all three of your lists, and when you put it on there, I really was not, like, I think I'd heard its name in passing, but I wasn't familiar with what it was at all. So I think it is quite almost like a forgotten film, which seems very unfair considering some of the other films from around the time which are remembered, which aren't as good as it.
So let's summarize then. Why do we all, I think this is one we all reasonably agree on, why do we all really like Girlfriend? Start with Dawn.
Yeah, I just think it's a really interesting kind of character study, and we didn't even talk about mumblecore. It's very mumblecore-y, especially the ending. Yeah, I think it's such an important film. It's influenced a lot of things, and rightly so, because it's a great watch, and it is funny, and got great characters, and it's very subtle and deals with all those issues that we discussed previously. Yeah.
Okay. Kev?
Oh, right. No one calls me Kev. That was confusing. Yeah, no, it's a cracking film. it's also, interestingly, this is the second female director we've got on this list, and it's another film by a female director that is deeply suspicious of the institution of marriage, which is just an interesting little psychological portrait of female directors in the 70s. But yeah, that's sort of, I'm quite anti-marriage as well, so maybe that's why it appeals to a very deep-seated sense of me. But I find it funny, and again, as I've said, I find Melanie Maron's performance is so likeable, and just brilliantly textured, that I find her a really easy company. And Eli Wallach and Christopher Guest are both brilliant supports. And I think, as Joel's kind of pointed out, it gives everyone a fair shake. No one is a bad person in the film. Everyone kind of, you could easily have like a sort of dodgy guy character who's sort of a bit of a cheat, and the rabbi particularly doesn't do anything particularly nice in the film, but is a sympathetic character. He seems like a confused older man. So yeah, it's got a very multi-layered characters, and again, the aesthetic, yeah, it's got almost verging on neorealism, which is very interesting for a low-budget American film at the time. Yes, it's warm company.
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with that. I think it's a film where you would quite happily sit down and have a coffee with any of the characters in it. And I don't think that's something that can be said for a huge amount of films. Usually you'll find someone in there that you're like, oh, no, don't like that person. But
also, Bob Balaban, you get to see him in the nude. So
Yeah.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. I don't know if I particularly want to see Bob Balaban in the nude, but you do get to see him, yeah.
Brushing his teeth, bearing his arse.
Yes, very much is, yeah. But yeah, I love that. I love that type of film, like independent little sort of character studies, especially when it's dealing with like their relationships and the issues of the day and stuff like that. That's totally the kind of film I'm generally into. I like the whole movement it started. Don talks about mumblecore. Also, probably there wouldn't have been a lot of American independent cinema of the 90s without Girlfriends. I think it's probably reasonably fair to say. And yeah, I think it really makes you feel a part of those characters' lives. And I think that's a difficult thing to achieve, and I think it achieves it remarkably well. What about you, Chris?
So I'm not normally a big fan of Joel saying that he loves independent character dramas with a sort of realist aesthetic, and I'm not normally a big fan of that. But I think that this is one of the rare exceptions where I would never say that this is one of my favorite films, because it's not my kind of cinema, but I do think that a lot of them feel quite self-indulgent, and they feel very much like, oh, I think that I have a very interesting life and I want to put that on screen. And you're like, do you though? And I think in this film, everything feels very genuine, and it also feels as though it's experiences which probably, like especially at the time, hadn't really been discussed in sort of mainstream cinema. And so I think that it is a very charming and heartwarming at points film. So yeah, even for me, who isn't a huge fan of this genre, this was a nice surprise, and I would recommend people sort of checking it out if you haven't heard about it before.
Cool. So we're on to the final film of the day, which is Ali, Fear Eats the Soul. I think you're desperately wanting to describe this one, so go ahead.
Ali, Fear Eats the Soul is a film made in Germany by Rainer Fassbinder. And it's about this kind of old German lady. She's probably only like 50, but people in the 70s look ancient. So like this kind of older woman, mature woman, shall we say, who like she goes into a cafe one rainy day, and there's a group of the implication is that they're kind of newly emigrated people from I think it's Morocco. Is it Morocco or Algeria? I'm not sure which.
It's Morocco.
It's Morocco. Yeah, it's Morocco. And there's a guy there who kind of almost on a dare from his friends dances with her. But then as the night progresses, they discover that despite the fact that one of them is a sort of younger man from Morocco, and one of them is an older lady from Germany. They got on really well, and then she takes him back to his place, and things happen. And they sort of continue their relationship, but a lot of people don't really approve of it. Mainly the people who live in her building and her family and the people she works with, who have a lot of racist attitudes. But interestingly, there's also some attitudes about her being an older woman from from Ali's friends, which I think there's a lot of interesting tensions that ensue.
It's a very interesting film. I'll be upfront. I'm not a Rainer Weiner Fassbinder fan as a rule. I think his aesthetic doesn't necessarily appeal to me, to coin a much used phrase from Chris. It's there's something about the way he uses realism tends to just not do much for me emotionally. But I think intellectually it's a very good film, and I think the fact that it's not just about racist characters. It uses the backdrop of Nazi Germany, which gets referenced quite frequently throughout the film, and also the reasonably recent at the time Munich bombings, and the characters' attitudes to that. And similar, a sort of contemporary comparison might be, say, the London bombings and how that feared an increasing Islamophobia. So it has that. So it's not simply a racism is bad picture. It looks at a much broader idea of how the media influences this in a really subtle way, and also about how we other each other and the sort of tribalism that ensues from both parties. So it's quite a compelling character study of both these characters, and the way that their relationship plays out. I think that they have a very pleasant relationship, but there's not really much of a sexual dimension to them. There's not much passion behind it. They just sort of have a certain kinship with each other more than anything else. And that it's interesting that the film, without spoiling too much, those are where the real fault lines lie, rather than the racial element. It's the age difference and the fact they can't kind of sexually satisfy each other by the end. So yeah, I find it an interesting psychological portrait of two people.
And Don?
I think I definitely liked it a lot more than I did the first time. I think the first time I watched it was the first Fassbinder film I watched, so I think after getting used to his style, I think I maybe enjoyed it a bit more. It's an interesting idea that they're both kind of invisible in society before they meet, but then when they're together, they're the opposite of that, that they kind of draw everyone's attention. And I guess the film kind of puts you in that perspective with it being quite detached and a lot of kind of wide shots that make you feel like you're observing them as well, and puts you in that position to make you decide how you judge them as well.
Yeah.
I really like all the colours and the framing, and it's kind of hauntingly beautiful, I find. The performances are quite detached, but so full of emotion at the same time, I feel.
I would agree with all of that. I think this idea of like the portrayal of othering people and the other is really interesting throughout the film, and it's interesting to me that sort of about 3/4 of the way through, when Emmy and Ali have been sort of ostracized from the group, they go away together and they come back. The group then needs something from Emmy and Ali, and Emmy immediately starts to sort of show him off in an unpleasant way to her friends and treat him in an almost like an animal, basically, where she's saying, well, look at his muscles, touch him, and it's that makes him distance himself from her. And I find that interesting. That's a different way of dealing with it than you would typically see, where the man just goes off and has an affair because she's an older woman. It's actually there's almost a reason for it, and it's a very interesting way of dealing with it. I really like that. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I part of the film which I really like is towards the end, where a lot of the people who were, I think this kind of gives it a bit more nuance, is a lot of the people who she knows are immediately disgusted by him because he's not white. But the more interesting part I find is later on, where her family and her workers, the people that she works with, and like her neighbors, all kind of come round to it as long as he fits into their lifestyles. So there's like bits where they go like, oh, why don't you do these favors for me? Or like, oh, why don't you, like, the way that they speak to him feels very sort of condescending. And that's, I think, the most interesting part is the fact that they're like, by the end, these people think that they're being accepting, but in a way they're possibly being like, they're causing more distancing in the relationship than ever before, because it's like, oh, well, you can only go out with my mother if you sort of become part of this lifestyle.
And I think it's like Fassbinder's attempt at a sort of, as he quite often does, attempting a melodrama in his own quite bizarre, it's quite his own quite bizarre approach to a melodrama. So what, like, I know that Kev's kind of briefly mentioned that he's not that big on Fassbinder. What are, Don and Chris, what do you both sort of think of Fassbinder as a whole, and also that aesthetic that he's using in this particularly?
Yeah, I guess I really like the aesthetic of his films sometimes more than I like the films. Like, there's some that I have really liked, and then some that I thought were okay. But I do really enjoy watching them anyway, and I will keep watching them.
What about you, Chris? Because obviously quite often you talk about aesthetics and things, so what about in this one?
Yeah, I think so. It's a complicated thing, because I think that I like individual shots in this film, but I do think that there's a distance created by the way that he films things. Like, as Kev said, I don't find this story very sort of emotionally connective. I think that it's a very interesting portrayal of the characters, and I think that it's deals with a lot of interesting topics. But I never found myself sort of empathizing on the level, as though, like, with some of the other films, it's as though you're like sort of looking through a window at sort of real people.
Well, I think I think it's a very fair point, and I think that the way that Fassbinder uses shots isn't necessarily designed to hit an emotional resonance, but I think he is trying to hammer home his intellectual points. So you've got framing in which characters are very divided in very overly sort of almost Brechtian ways that alienate the audience emotionally, but you understand exactly what he means intellectually.
I think he's doing that thing where he thinks that if you connect too much with the individuals, then you won't pay attention. You'll go, oh, this is really sad for these two people, rather than like connecting with the wider issues, which means that is, as we've all said, a very kind of intellectually stimulating film, but possibly quite a cold film.
And Don, do you have any fun facts on Ali?
I do. It was shot in just under 2 weeks, and it was planned as an exercise in filmmaking to fill in time in Fassbinder's schedule. They just cashed it out.
Oh, under 2 weeks is insane.
I mean, Fassbinder was like insane. Generally, he died at about the age of 40, and he famously died with 3 typewriters in front of him, loaded on cocaine, a cigarette in his mouth, and the TV on. Which, you know, I can barely like bother my arse to write 100 words in a day. You know, I don't know how he managed, but he was a very strange, controversial man. He didn't treat his actors very well. He didn't treat people very well, but he was incredibly focused.
Yeah.
So the idea that you might knock this out in 2 weeks wouldn't surprise me.
No. So let's sum up then. Why do we all love Ali Fears the Soul? Don?
I guess I do kind of like that, the detached quality of it. I think it doesn't really ever tell you how to feel like melodrama might, you know, with the kind of probably over emotion of it. And I like that even though it's quite short, it does manage to pack a lot in, and that every scene in it feels very necessary. I think I don't really remember any scene now. I'm like, oh, what was the point of that? I think maybe that's because it was made in 2 weeks. It is very kind of focused and yeah, and the colours and yeah, I like how comfortable they are with each other in a way. Like there's some scenes where they just it feels really natural for them to be together in a way without them saying anything, which is quite strange. I don't know. It somehow works.
Yeah. And Kev?
Yeah, you know what, I've got to admit, chatting about it now, it's such an intellectually rich film that I love it more than I did 20 minutes ago. I just really enjoyed talking about it. And I think it is one of those films, is it's got a very human aspect to it, of just this couple who can't quite be together because of racism, which if an American film did that, would do it so cack-handedly. But Fassbinder's really interested in doing these, in probing the human psyche, that makes it compelling and rich to discuss, and it does stick with you, and you wonder about characters' motivations for far longer than the film itself lasts. So yeah, it's very good.
Chris?
Yeah, I think just the idea, I think Kev kind of hit on the nail there, the fact that like it is almost, it's a movie about social issues, but it's not like a message movie. And I think that makes it quite a strong film, because it's a film that's very interested in taking apart all the social factors around this relationship and within it, but it's not sort of standing there on a soapbox kind of trying to shout at you. And I think that actually makes it a lot more powerful, and it makes you think a lot more about the issues, because of how complex everything is. And it makes you, some of the characters, like the shopkeeper, it's like the fact that he has these sort of elements of trying to be nicer later on that are so transparent, it actually makes you like him even less than if he was like comically evil. And so yeah, I think it's a very sort of stimulating film, like to think about the issues.
Yeah, so for me, I agree with everything you've all said. I think it's one of those films that I find myself thinking about for quite a long time after I've watched it, and I totally agree with you, Kev. Like every discussion of it brings something new out, and everybody kind of comes out of it with a different point of view. And I like that it's tackling a story about relationships, about race, about the issues of the time, but it's not tackling them in a particularly cack-handed way. It's tackling them in a really interesting way, and it's also a really interesting story, and it has actually some quite funny bits in it, some quite moving bits in it, but it's also told through Fassbinder's really weird, kind of bizarre storytelling method, which in this particular film works really well. So yeah, that's the 5 films we picked as the best films of the 70s. Some interesting debate, some interesting disagreements, and some like girlfriends that surprised me a little bit. That like, Chris, you liked us much, and it's interesting to come into these discussions. So what would everyone pick as their favourite film of the 70s, or the best film of the 70s? Kev?
I mean, The Heartbreak Kid, obviously.
Yes.
No. I mean, I think I would probably have to go with The Taxi Driver. Or The Taxi Driver, sorry. The Taxi Driver. No, Taxi Driver, I think, is an exceptional character portrait, and I understand why it would wind some people up. It certainly did when it was released, and it continues to. I find how contentious it is very stimulating and interesting. Yeah, I think it's a brilliant portrait of New York at the time, and a portrait of the political spectrum at the time as well.
Don?
I think for me it's probably between Taxi Driver and Heartbreak Kid, and it's very difficult to decide between the two of them because they are so different. Yeah, but maybe because Heartbreak Kid is quite underrated, I will go for that, because I think I enjoyed it a lot more on a rewatch than I enjoyed Taxi Driver a lot more on a rewatch, if that makes sense. I think I've always kind of liked Taxi Driver at this level, and Heartbreak Kid is going up.
Chris?
I mean, you said at the start of this, like, what do you think the best out of what we picked to be the best of the 70s is? And I mean, I did not pick any of these films. I don't think that any of them are the best of the 70s. I can tell you which one I like the most out of the 5 films.
That's the premise of the podcast.
But I would like to preface that by saying that this is just the best out of the 5, rather than I don't think this is the best film of the 70s.
Just pick a fucking film, Chris. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I would go with Ali Theories the Soul. I think that it's like the most interesting out of these films, the most sort of intellectually stimulating. I do think that it's a bit of a cold film, which meant that I can't say that I would say it's one of my favourite films, but, you know, out of these ones, it's probably the best.
Never heard anything said with less enthusiasm. Well, I'd be between Girlfriends and The Heartbreak Kid, but I'd probably pick Girlfriends. So, yeah, I mean, for me, Girlfriends stands out as a really interesting character study with a lot of characters I love, and a vibe that I'm a huge fan of. So I guess this week we have
tiebreaker.
Tiebreaker, yeah.
I'm quite pleased with the fact that Celine and Julie was the only one that didn't get a vote. So.